In the winter of 1973, the celebrated horror author Julian Croft was at the peak of his career and simultaneously in his own private
Look at our
hell.
beautiful sandcastle.
We built it so high.
His novel, The Crow's Feast, had brought him international fame, critical acclaim, and immense wealth. However, that success had also placed upon him a mountain of expectation that was crushing his creativity. For months, he hadn't been able to write a single line, so he had fled, escaping the noise of civilization and the suffocating attention of his fans to take refuge in the St. Augustine Lighthouse on the Oregon coast. It was a stone saint standing vigil at the edge of the world, perched on a rocky stretch of land that curled away from the mainland like a serpent's tail, becoming an island whenever storms raged. For Croft, this was a sacred sanctuary where he hoped to summon his muse once more. His study, a small circular room just below the lantern room at the very top of the lighthouse, was his fortress. The curved walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that disappeared into the shadows. The spirits of the Dark Masters, Poe, Lovecraft, Shirley Jackson, watched him from the spines of their leather-bound tombs. The sharp, briny smell of the air was mixed with the sweet scent of old paper and expensive pipe tobacco. At night, the massive beam of the lighthouse would sweep over the room like a phantom, bathing it in a momentary, blinding light every 30 seconds before abandoning it to the gloom once more. Croft believed this absolute isolation was the crucible required to reignite his famously dark genius. But this retreat had a dark secret. Julian Croft was not alone in the lighthouse. Unknown to his publisher and the public, a woman named Ilara and their 5-year-old daughter, Lily, were also with him. Croft's meticulously crafted image of the reclusive genius could not be tarnished by the mundanity of a family life. So Ilara and Lily lived a hidden existence in the old keeper's quarters in the lower levels of the lighthouse, concealed from the world. Croft's one rigid rule was absolute silence. The slightest noise, especially the sound of a child, was enough to shatter his fragile concentration like glass. This dynamic had created a silent, simmering tension within the stone walls of the lighthouse. On that fateful night of November 12th, the Pacific Ocean had surrendered to one of the most violent storms in recent memory. The wind howled like a wolf, and colossal waves battered the rocks at the lighthouse's foundation. For Croft, this chaos was a blessing. The roar of the storm could, at the very least, drown out the small, irritating sounds that might drift up from the floors below. He sat at his desk, took a large gulp of whiskey, and, as part of his ritual to find inspiration, pressed the record button on his Akai reel-to-reel tape recorder to capture the sound of the room. The blank white page in his typewriter had been staring back at him for hours. But even the deafening roar of the storm could not suppress that one sound. He heard it, just as he was on the verge of a sentence, in the most delicate moment of his focus. A melody. A thin, off-key, tinny melody. It was coming from downstairs, Lily's music box, that damned lullaby Ilara played to put her to sleep. In that instant, something inside Julian Croft snapped. He had completely lost control. He shoved his chair back with a screech, his face a mask of terrifying rage, and stormed out of the room, starting down the circular staircase. There was only one thought in his mind. That sound must stop. 3 days later, a 70-year-old fisherman named George Billow, his face weathered and creased by the sea and wind, approached the lighthouse in his small boat after the storm had subsided. George was the only person who brought Croft his weekly supplies. He knew the writer was a strange and distant man, but he respected him. This time, however, something was wrong. The lighthouse's heavy iron door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. This was something Croft, who guarded his privacy like a fortress gate, would never do. "Mr. Croft," he called out. His voice echoed in the stone corridors and died. There was no answer. With a growing sense of dread, he climbed the stairs. The scene he found in the study would haunt him for the rest of his life. Everything was in its place, but it was all wrong. There was a frozen, abandoned feeling in the air. The empty chair, the cold coffee, the lonely page in the typewriter, and in the corner, the tape recorder. Its reel was spinning silently, senselessly, like a film that had run out. It was as if everything in the room had stopped breathing, but the machine kept turning, as if it had borne witness to the final moment. George knew something was very, very wrong. He turned and ran faster than he had ever run in his life, back to his boat, back to alert the nearest Coast Guard station. The official reports from the scene stated that there were no signs of a struggle and no evidence of forced entry. Julian Croft, Ilara, and little Lily had simply vanished, as if swallowed by a phantom, leaving no trace behind. 50 years later, in the summer of 2023, a young man named Leo Miller was wandering through the dusty aisles of a massive flea market in Portland. For Leo, history wasn't just a collection of words in books. History was a sound. He was a hunter of lost sounds, a translator of ghostly whispers for the digital age. His small studio was a sanctuary filled with old audio equipment, all waiting to be brought back to life. His grandfather had been a signal officer in World War II, and Leo had grown up listening to his old recordings. He believed that saving those moments, those sounds, was like opening a window to the past. That Saturday morning, after hours of hopeless searching, just as he was about to give up, he saw it. It was shoved under a table, behind a pile of old military blankets and a box of tangled cables. An Akai 4000 DS Mark II, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a 90-pound beast of a machine. Its chassis was covered in scratches and dings, the battle scars of time and neglect. But for Leo, those scars were medals. This machine had lived a life. It had seen things, heard things. He knelt down and pulled the machine towards him. That's when he noticed something. A dusty brown tape was still threaded through the machine. He lifted the cover. On the faded handwritten label, he could make out a single word: storm. In that moment, he felt a connection. This machine was calling to him. After settling on a price of $20 with the seller, he painstakingly carried his treasure to his car. That night, Leo's studio was transformed into an operating room. First, he cleaned the inside of the deck with compressed air, blowing out decades of dust and cobwebs. Then, with surgical precision, he replaced the old dried-out rubber belts with new ones. Using cotton swabs dipped in isopropyl alcohol, he scrubbed the tape heads, the capstans, and the guides until they shone. This was more than a repair. It was like paying respects to the dead. Finally, when he was sure everything was in its place, he plugged it in. He pressed the power button. A small lamp inside one of the VU meters lit up with a warm, amber glow. The motors whirred softly to life. The beast had awakened from its slumber. He carefully rewound the tape. He turned on his speakers, and with a trembling finger, he pressed the yellowed play button. First, the familiar, comforting sound of hiss and static from the speakers, the sound of time itself. Then, a voice. Deep, confident, a slightly gravelly baritone. A voice that filled the room like a storm. The storm is coming. The sea is a beast, waiting with its mouth open to swallow secrets. Leo held his breath. He knew that voice. It was the voice of the legendary author Julian Croft, who had disappeared 50 years ago. He understood what he had found. This was a lost treasure, a previously unheard reading from Croft. He was dizzy with excitement. The reading continued for 15 minutes. Croft's voice was mesmerizing. Then it abruptly stopped, but the tape kept turning. Leo thought the recording was over, but then the silence. It stretched on. A strange, expectant silence. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. Leo leaned towards the speakers. There was nothing but the almost inaudible hiss of the tape. And then, something beneath it. A whisper. It was so faint, Leo first thought it was his own imagination, a pattern in the static. He closed his eyes, focusing all his attention on the sound. He cranked the volume knob all the way up. The speakers crackled. There it was, unmistakable, the voice of a child.
Not crying, not pleading, just whispering, a murmuring, song-like mumble, and another rhythm beneath the voice, an irregular, mechanical clicking. Click, click, click. Leo's entire body went cold. This was not part of the text. This was something captured by accident, something real. The whisper pierced through the veil of static for a single, clear moment and stabbed directly into Leo's brain. Just 3 words, but those 3 words changed everything in the room, turning his excitement into an icy dread. Inside, the wall. Leo sat frozen in his chair. The rest of the recording was only the blind, deafening roar of the Pacific Ocean. The child's voice never returned. Leo didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke, in the blue-gray light of his studio, he listened again and again to that 30 seconds of silence and the impossible whisper held within it. What he had found was not a literary treasure. It was a tombstone.
The sun rose, but Leo Miller didn't notice. His world had shrunk to the 4 walls of his studio, and the universe within it had collapsed into a single 30-second loop of audio. He sat in the blue-gray light of dawn, his face illuminated by the complex waveforms on his monitor, listening for the 100th time to the impossible whisper. Inside the wall. It was no longer just a sound. It had become an obsession, a splinter in his mind. The initial thrill of discovering a lost recording by a literary giant had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. He had stumbled into something far darker than a forgotten piece of art. He was listening to an echo from a tomb. For the next 48 hours, Leo worked with a feverish intensity. His process, normally a patient and respectful act of audio restoration, became a desperate forensic excavation. He isolated the 30-second fragment, the silence, the whisper, the storm, and began to dissect it. He applied layers of digital filters, peeling back the thick blanket of hiss and storm rage like an archaeologist brushing dust from a fossil. According to forensic audio analysts, recovering a whisper from a 50-year-old magnetic tape, especially one recorded under such chaotic conditions, is a near impossible task. The magnetic particles that hold the sound degrade over time. The signal fades. The hiss itself is the sound of the past turning to dust. Leo was fighting against time, noise, and decay itself. Slowly, painstakingly, the whisper grew clearer. It was undeniably a child, and the words were definite. But as he cleaned the audio, another sound, previously buried too deep to notice, began to emerge from the noise floor. At first, he thought it was some kind of electronic interference, but as he isolated the frequency and amplified it, a melody took shape. It was a lullaby. The tune was simple, almost familiar, but it was being played horribly out of tune, as if by a broken music box.
The notes were sour, the rhythm faltered, creating a sound that was profoundly unsettling. It was a sound of innocence corrupted, a comforting melody twisted into something menacing. The discovery chilled Leo more than the whisper itself. A child's whisper could be a sign of fear, but a broken lullaby? That was the sound of madness. Leo knew he had reached the limit of what technology could tell him. The sounds were real, but they were without context. The phrase, "inside the wall," was a key without a lock. To understand what it meant, he needed someone who had been there, someone who had stood in that room in 1973. He needed to find a witness. The name from the old newspaper articles came back to him. Arthur Vance, the rookie deputy sheriff who was first on the scene. Finding him was not easy. In the digital age, Arthur Vance had become a ghost. He wasn't in any phone directories, he had no social media presence. Leo spent a day digging through online public records, voter registrations, and municipal archives. He found 2 disconnected numbers and an old address in a different county. Finally, a search through a local Veterans Association database gave him a possible match in a small, coastal town a few hours south of Portland. With a knot in his stomach, he dialed the number. The voice that answered was gravelly, impatient, worn down by time. Leo quickly explained who he was and what he was calling about. "The Julian Croft case?" Arthur's voice was thick with suspicion. "No one's opened that file in 40 years, son. What's your angle? Writing a book?" Leo would later recall the exhaustion in the old man's voice, the sound of someone who had been bothered by treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists too many times. He knew he had one chance. "I'm not a reporter, Mr. Vance," Leo said, his voice steady. "I'm an audio archivist, and I have a recording from that night, from inside the lighthouse." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence, the sound of a 50-year-old wound being torn open. After a long moment, the gravelly voice returned, softer this time. "Meet me for coffee tomorrow morning, the Sandpiper Diner on the Coast Highway. And bring your machine." The Sandpiper Diner was a relic of another time, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of salt and coffee. Arthur Vance sat in a booth by the window, staring out at the gray, churning ocean. He was an old man, but his eyes, when they locked onto Leo as he walked in, were sharp and missed nothing. He looked at Leo, then at the laptop bag in his hand. "All right, kid," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's hear your ghost." Leo sat down, opened his laptop, and played the audio. He watched Arthur's face. The old man's expression was an unreadable mask as he listened to Julian Croft's arrogant theatrical baritone. He didn't flinch. But then the reading stopped. The long silence began. Leo saw Arthur lean forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, and then the whisper came. The effect was immediate and profound. The color drained from Arthur Vance's face. He sat bolt upright, his coffee cup rattling in its saucer. He stared at the laptop as if it were a venomous snake. When the whisper ended, he looked at Leo, his eyes wide with a look that was part shock, part validation, part horror. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost he had only ever suspected was real. "Play it again," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. Leo played it again. "Inside the wall." "My God," Arthur breathed, turning to stare out at the ocean. He wasn't looking at the waves. He was looking back 50 years. He began to speak, his voice low, almost to himself. "I was a rookie then, 25 years old. It was my first major case. I remember that room. The smell was off. A Swedish smell, like rot, but not quite. And the wall, the north wall. It was a stone lighthouse, but one section, maybe 3 or 4 feet square, was smooth plaster. It looked newer than the rest."
He told Leo how he had pointed it out to his superior, a senior detective on the verge of retirement. The detective had laughed at him. The official narrative was already being written, shaped by the publisher and the media. The 1973 news bulletins told the clean, tragic story of a literary genius consumed by the very ocean that inspired him. It was a poetic end, a story that sold books. No one, especially not the high-profile author's powerful publisher, wanted to look for a darker, messier truth. "My boss told me to stop chasing ghosts," Arthur recalled, a bitter edge to his voice. He said, "The man drowned, Vance. Go find some real evidence." I was young. I was a rookie. I didn't push it, but I never forgot it. The wall, the smell, the feeling that we were all missing something right in front of our faces. That file was officially closed, but in my mind, it never closed. Not really. In that small diner, surrounded by the mundane clatter of plates and conversation, an alliance was forged. Two men from two different generations bound together by a 50-year-old whisper. Leo had the key, but Arthur had the memory of the lock it was meant for. They knew that going to the authorities now would be useless. A garbled whisper on an old tape and a retired cop's hunch were not enough to reopen a legendary cold case. If they were going to find the truth, they would have to find it themselves. They spent the next few days in Leo's studio, which now served as their makeshift investigation headquarters. Arthur's memories gave context to Leo's audio evidence. Now they needed physical proof. They needed to know what was behind that wall. Leo went back to digging, this time through digital state archives, looking for anything he could find on the St. Augustine Lighthouse. He found it. In the Oregon State Archives, in a folder of digitized architectural records, a set of original blueprints drawn in India ink on linen, dated 1894. He zoomed in on the layout for the top floors, his heart hammered in his chest. There it was. Just as the plans showed, behind the north wall of the circular study, there was another small, windowless room. It was labeled salt storage on the blueprints, but a typewritten annotation on the margin, dated 1952, noted that the room had been sealed during a structural renovation. Sealed off. Walled up. Or as Leo thought with a chill, turned into a prison. Now they had it all. The whisper from the tape, the memory of a plastered wall, and a map showing a room that wasn't supposed to exist. There was only one thing left to do. "We can't just breaking down walls," Leo said, his voice hesitant. Arthur looked at him, his old eyes clear and determined. 50 years ago, I let a superior officer tell me to stand down," he said, his voice firm. "I've lived with that regret ever since. I'm not standing down again. This isn't about a case anymore, kid. This is for the child on that tape." They gathered their equipment.
A heavy-duty crowbar, a sledgehammer, powerful flashlights, and, of course, Leo's portable audio recorder to document whatever they might find. They loaded the gear into Arthur's old, beaten-up pickup truck. As they left Portland, a light rain began to fall, the sky turning a bruised shade of gray. They drove south along the coast highway, the ocean a turbulent, menacing presence to their right. They barely spoke, each man lost in his own thoughts, the truck's cabin filled with a tense, heavy silence. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers was like a metronome, counting down the seconds to a 50-year-old confrontation. They were no longer just chasing a ghost story. They were no longer just a sound archivist and a retired cop. They were heading to a tomb, and they were about to break it open.
The old pickup truck bounced along the cracked and weed-choked asphalt of the access road, coming to a stop where the land crumbled away into the sea. Before them, silhouetted against a bruised gray sky, stood the St. Augustine Lighthouse. It was no longer the proud sentinel of Julian Croft's time, 50 years of neglect had turned it into a tombstone for itself. Rust bled in long orange tears from every iron fitting. The white paint had peeled away in leprous patches, revealing the dark, weathered stone beneath. The lantern room at the top was a broken crown of shattered glass, staring out at the ocean with vacant eyes. A profound and terrible silence surrounded the place, broken only by the cry of gulls and the relentless sigh of the waves. Arthur Vance killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was deafening. He stared at the lighthouse, his face a mask of grim nostalgia. "She looks smaller," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I remember her looking like a giant back then." Leo, sitting in the passenger seat, adjusted the portable audio recorder hanging from a strap around his neck. He pressed the record button. A small red light blinked to life, capturing the ambient sound of the wind and the sea. For him, this was not just an investigation, it was an act of preservation. Whatever secrets this place held, he would give them a voice. They got out of the truck, the damp, salty air hitting them at once. They grabbed their gear from the truck bed: 2 powerful flashlights, a sledgehammer, a crowbar, and a bag with water and a first aid kit. They walked the overgrown path to the massive iron door at the base of the tower. A heavy rusted chain was wrapped around the handles, secured by a padlock that had long ago fused into a solid lump of corrosion. "So much for the key," Arthur grunted. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the thick chain links. With a sharp groaning tear of metal on metal, one of the links snapped. The chain fell away with a heavy clatter that echoed in the unnatural quiet. Arthur pushed on the heavy door. It resisted, then moved with a deep, mournful groan, opening just enough for them to slip through into the darkness inside. The air that rushed out to meet them was stale, heavy, and held a profound and terrible stillness. For a long moment they just stood there, allowing their eyes to adjust to the oppressive dark. Leo swept the beam of his flashlight across the base of the tower. It revealed a circular room of damp, weeping stone, the floor littered with debris and the droppings of seabirds who had found their way in through broken windows far above. An enormous cast-iron spiral staircase dominated the center of the room, snaking its way up into an abyss of shadow. It looked less like a staircase and more like the spine of some long-dead leviathan. "He was never down here," Arthur said, his voice a low echo in the cavernous space. "He lived and worked at the top, said it was the only way to be close to the sky." He took the first step on the iron stair, and the resulting clang was so loud it made them both flinch. Every sound they made would be an announcement of their intrusion. Silently, they began to climb. The ascent was slow and unnerving. The only light came from their 2 flashlight beams, which danced and darted into the darkness above, creating frantic, elongated shadows on the curved walls. Cobwebs, thick and gray with the dust of decades, hung from the railings like funeral shrouds, brushing against their faces as they passed. A steady drip, drip, drip from somewhere above provided a maddening rhythmic counterpoint to the hollow clang of their footsteps. Leo kept his recorder held high, the sensitive microphone capturing every echo, every scrape of their boots, every sharp intake of breath. He was recording the sound of a haunting. With every turn of the spiral, the air grew colder, heavier. They were not just climbing higher in space, but deeper in time, moving toward the epicenter of a 50-year-old tragedy. Arthur moved with a grim determination, one hand gripping the cold iron railing, the other holding his flashlight beam steady. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of climbing, they reached the top landing. A single wooden door stood before them, the door to Julian Croft's study. The wood was swollen and warped from half a century of damp sea air. The doorknob, a brass fitting, was coated in a green patina of age. Arthur put his hand on it, hesitated, then turned. The latch clicked loudly, but the door wouldn't budge, swollen shut in its frame. Arthur sighed and stepped back. "Figures," he muttered. He braced his shoulder and slammed his weight against it. The wood groaned in protest. He hit it again, harder this time. With a sound like a breaking bone, the door jamb splintered and the door swung violently inward, crashing against the bookshelf inside. They stood in the doorway, peering into the room where it all ended. It was a time capsule of neglect. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust, softening the sharp edges of the furniture into ghostly suggestions. The grand desk still faced the windows, its surface a landscape of decay. The typewriter sat in the center, a rusted metallic skeleton. A flock of dead flies formed a dark constellation on the dusty glass of the windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of moldering paper, and damp wool from the rotting oriental rug. It was the smell of a place where time itself had died. Leo stepped in first, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The dust motes danced in the light like a million tiny spirits. He moved deeper into the room, his recorder capturing the soft crunch of his boots on the gritty floor. Arthur followed, his eyes scanning the room, comparing this derelict scene to his 50-year-old memory. "It's all the same," he whispered, his voice full of awe and dread. "Just older. Colder." Leo's light fell upon the Akai reel-to-reel recorder in the corner, the very machine he had at home, though this one was a rusted hulk, its tape long since rotted away. His gaze, however, was drawn to the north wall. There it was, just as Arthur had described it. In the sweeping curve of the ancient stone wall, there was a rectangular section of perfectly smooth, eerily modern-looking plaster. It was a scar, an unnatural patch on the time-worn skin of the lighthouse. It didn't belong. He walked towards it, reaching out a hand. The plaster was cold and smooth, completely different from the rough, cold stone surrounding it. He knocked on it. The sound was a dull, solid thud. Then he knocked on the stone next to it. That sound was deeper, more resonant. "It's here," Leo said, his voice tight. "Arthur, it's right here." Arthur came to his side, placing a hand on the plaster as well. He nodded slowly. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong with this wall." There was a long moment of silence as the two men stared at the blank white rectangle. It was the final barrier between a 50-year-old question and its monstrous answer. The air grew thick with anticipation. "You ready for this, kid?" Arthur asked, his voice low. Leo simply nodded, unable to speak. Arthur hefted the sledgehammer, its heavy head seeming to absorb the light in the room. He took his stance, his feet wide apart. The silence stretched. Then, with a guttural yell that was half effort and half rage, he swung. The impact was like a cannon shot. The sound of the hammer hitting the wall was a violent, obscene violation of the 50-year silence. A web of cracks instantly appeared in the plaster, and a cloud of white dust exploded into the air. He swung again. Crack! A large chunk of plaster fell away, revealing the dark, older bricks underneath, mortared together with a sloppier, more ancient technique. He kept swinging. Again and again, the rhythmic, brutal impacts echoing down the spiral staircase and out into the empty sky. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the plaster dust, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was more than demolition. It was an exorcism. Finally, with one last powerful blow, a brick dislodged and fell inward, disappearing into the darkness on the other side. A hole. And from that hole rushed a wave of air. It was a foul, putrid smell, the smell of profound dampness, of rot, and of something else, the sickly sweet odor of old decay. It was the smell of Arthur remembered, magnified 1,000 times. He staggered back, coughing. Leo felt his stomach turn. They used the crowbar to pry away more bricks, widening the opening until it was large enough for a person to crawl through. Leo aimed his flashlight into the void. The beam cut through the swirling dust and revealed a small, dark space. It wasn't a room. It was a cage. No more than 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, a cramped, stone-lined box. Arthur went in first, his movements slow and deliberate.
Leo followed, crawling on his hands and knees through the jagged opening, his recorder held in front of him. They stood up, their heads nearly touching the low ceiling. The air inside was suffocatingly close. Their flashlight beams swept across the tiny chamber. In one corner lay a small, pathetic mound of what might have once been a mattress, now just a pile of rotted, stained fabric and moldy straw. The stone walls were slick with moisture, but what made Leo's blood run cold were the drawings. Scratched into the stone, likely using a shard of rock, were the crude, desperate etchings of a child. A drawing of a tall, thin lighthouse surrounded by angry, swirling waves. A stick figure of a little girl with a sad face, and next to her, a tall, imposing shadow of a man with no face at all. As Arthur's light scanned the floor, it glinted off something metallic, half buried in the debris of the rotted mattress. He knelt down and carefully unearthed it. It was a small, tarnished metal music box, its lid crusted shut with corrosion. A wave of nausea washed over Leo. He knew, with an absolute and chilling certainty, that this was the source of the broken lullaby on the tape.
He moved his own light away toward the mattress. Something was sticking out from beneath the rotted fabric. Something small and white and unnervingly familiar. With a trembling hand, he brushed the debris away. It was a bone, a small one, a human rib cage fragile as a bird's. As they uncovered more, the horrifying truth revealed itself. The partial skeleton of a small child, curled in on itself, had been lying here, hidden, for 50 years. Arthur swore under his breath, a sound of pure anguish, and turned away. Leo felt a profound, bottomless sadness wash over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. They had found her, the girl with the whisper. As he stood there, reeling from the discovery, Leo's flashlight beam, almost by accident, caught a strange shape in a small crevice between the stone blocks of the back wall. It looked like a package, wrapped in something dark and oily. Driven by some last shred of professional instinct, he reached into the crevice. His fingers closed around a small, rectangular object wrapped in thick oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He pulled it out into the light. He carefully unwrapped the rotting cloth. Inside, perfectly preserved, was another, smaller reel of tape, and on the faded label, written in a neat, almost delicate hand, was a single, chilling word: lullaby.
They stood in the cramped stone tomb, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the 50-year-old darkness. The silence that followed the discovery of the tape was heavier and more profound than the stone walls around them. The search was over. The hunt was done. Now all that remained was the verdict. Leo looked at the small, fragile bones curled on the rotted mattress, then at the oilcloth-wrapped tape in his hand. This was her voice, her final testament. Arthur, the old cop, took off his hat, his shoulders slumping as the weight of 5 decades settled upon him. He closed his eyes and said nothing, but his lips moved in a silent prayer. With a reverence that bordered on holy, Leo gently took off his own jacket, unfolded it, and laid it over the small skeleton, a final, inadequate shroud against the cold. There were no more words to be said here. Silently, they crawled back through the jagged hole in the wall, back into Julian Croft's dusty study. They didn't look back. Their retreat down the spiral staircase was the opposite of their tense ascent. There was no more fear of the unknown, only the crushing certainty of the known. Every clanging footstep on the iron stairs was a beat in a funeral dirge. The lighthouse was no longer a place of mystery. It was a crime scene, a monument to a monstrous secret. When they finally stepped back out into the gray open air, it felt like surfacing from a deep-sea dive, their lungs aching for air that wasn't thick with the ghosts of the dead. The drive back to Portland was a long, silent vigil.
The small tape reel sat on the dashboard between them, nestled in its oilcloth wrapping. It was no longer just a piece of magnetic tape. It was a bomb, an artifact of pure horror that they were now tasked with detonating. Arthur drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the endless ribbon of wet asphalt. Leo stared out the window, watching the rugged coastline fly by, haunted by the image of a little girl's drawing scratched into a stone wall. Back in the sanctuary of Leo's studio, the mood was not one of triumph, but of solemn ritual. This was not an archivist's work anymore. This was an executioner's. Leo's hands, usually so steady in their delicate work, trembled as he took the small, fragile reel of tape. He carefully threaded the brittle brown ribbon through the guides of the Akai machine. Arthur sat in a chair in the corner of the room, as still as a statue, his face carved from stone. He was a man waiting for a sentence he already knew had been passed 50 years ago. Leo's finger hovered over the play button. He looked at Arthur. The old man met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. This was it, the point of no return. He pressed the button. The speakers hissed. And then the sound began. It was the music box, the same broken, off-key lullaby from the first tape, but clearer now, closer. Then a little girl's voice, innocent and pure, singing along with the discordant melody. It was the sound of a child in her own little world. Then a woman's voice, panicked, whispering urgently, "Alara." "Hush now, Lily, my love, please be quiet. Daddy's working, please." But the child, lost in her song, just kept singing. And then the sound that shattered the scene, the sound of the heavy study door from upstairs crashing open. And then his voice, but it wasn't Julian Croft, the author. It was something else, a guttural roar, a sound of pure, unrestrained rage that was barely human. "Silence!" The word was a physical blow. The music box stopped abruptly, Alara's voice screaming his name. "Julian, no! She's just a child! No!" And what followed on the tape was not a story. It was the sound of hell. The sounds of a violent struggle, of furniture overturning, of a woman's desperate screams shut short by a heavy, sickening thud that made both Leo and Arthur flinch violently. A terrible ringing silence followed, broken only by the sound of the little girl, Lily, now crying, her innocent singing replaced by shrieks of pure terror. The shrieks, too, were silenced. And then nothing. Absolute, soul-crushing silence, so deep it felt like the end of the world. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the hiss of the tape. Then, a new sound. The sound of a man's breathing, ragged, heavy, gasping breaths, the sound of a beast catching its breath after a kill. And finally, his voice returned, no longer roaring, but a low, calm, terrifying whisper, filled with a monstrous satisfaction. "The sea swallows all secrets. The sea swallows all distractions. Silence. Finally, perfect silence." The tape recorded the sound of heavy footsteps, a door opening to the still raging storm, and then only the sound of the wind and the rain remained, until it, too, faded into the final, empty hiss of a run-out tape.
The reel stopped spinning. The silence in Leo's studio was absolute. It was a silence filled with the screams they had just heard. Leo stared at the machine, his face pale, a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. He lunged for a trash can and was violently sick. Arthur Vance did not move. He sat in his chair, his old, weathered face a mask of utter devastation. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a slow, deliberate path through the wrinkles on his cheek. It was the only tear he had shed in 50 years. After a long time, he spoke, his voice a broken whisper. "We found her, kid," he said.
We heard her. The next morning, an anonymous call was made to the Oregon State Police. What followed was a quiet, professional storm. Forensics teams swarmed the lighthouse. The small bones, the music box, and the 2 tape reels were taken into evidence. The case of Julian Croft's disappearance was officially reopened, and within 48 hours, officially closed. The news story broke like a tsunami. Julian Croft, the tortured genius, the master of American horror, was a monster. His legacy, built on a foundation of eloquent darkness, crumbled into dust. Critics and academics re-examined his novels, seeing them now not as works of fiction, but as the thinly veiled confessions of a narcissistic sociopath. His books were pulled from university reading lists. His name became a synonym for deceit and brutality. The bright, celebrated star had collapsed into a black hole. A few months later, Arthur Vance sat on his porch, looking out at a calm blue sea. The splinter in his mind, the one he had carried for 50 years, was finally gone. He was at peace. In Portland, Leo Miller uploaded the final episode of his podcast, which he called Whispers in the Storm. It became a global phenomenon, but Leo refused all interviews. His final narration wasn't about the monster. It was a memorial. He gave the victims back their names, Ilara and Lily. He told the world not just how they died, but that they had lived. He gave them the dignity their killer had stolen. The 2 tape reels, the physical ghosts of that night, were eventually returned to him from the evidence locker. He placed them in a special, climate-controlled archival box. He labeled it simply E&L Croft. He no longer listened to the whispers. He didn't need to. He had done his job. He had saved the lost sounds. The story was over. A final testament that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried or how long it is silenced, will always wait, patiently, for someone, somewhere, to finally press play.